Cuphead, Calamity, Contra. These games are all home to some of the most infuriating boss fights, challenging bullet hell patterns and tightest controls to be found in any video game. 6 months ago, I set off on a journey to make a game that would top all of these, and take the crown as the most intense run-and-gun game ever made. Whoa, no spoilers. You gotta make the audience stick around for the good stuff. Ahoy! To start off this game dev story, we have to rewind the clocks back to May of this year. I had just finished my sophomore year of college. After failing to secure a summer job in my field, I was faced with the prospect of yet another summer where I would sit around twiddling my thumbs all day. In my boredom, I opened up a Google Doc and started up writing a game design document, as one does. As I wrote and wrote, I couldn't quite come up with a solid premise for a game. It was at this exact moment that I was struck with the gift of prophecy: Dodge Rolling Horse. This strange, captivating phrase entered my psyche and set up shop. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The only thing I could do was open up Sprite and start drawing. I designed a horse. Try again. There we go. Now it was time to create the unholy animation that had been plaguing me for days. Oh yeah, it was every bit as stupid as I expected. Now what to do with it? I had just recently finished a run of the Terraria Inferno mod, an expansion of Calamity that makes the game a billion times more difficult. I'm terrible at games, but the elation that I felt when I finally took out Supreme Calamitous and sent her ass to the Shadow Realm was unmatched. I knew what I was going to do. I was going to make a boss rush run and gun. And not just any boss rush, but the hardest game that I'm ever going to make. It was all starting to come together. The Dodge Rolling Horse, now named Roger, would be our protagonist. The plot would involve taking on a tournament of video game bosses, in order to gain your boss form and become the villain of your own game. Now all that was left was to start development. Working on the game was going well. I implemented the basic gameplay features and gave Roger his iconic dodge roll. After I'd set up the basics, I decided to introduce my game to the world with a quick video. As much as I was just messing around with content creation, not really expecting the video to do well, I was extremely pleased to see that 7,000 people wanted to watch my funny horse roll around. Hit with a huge wave of motivation, I started implementing the game's first boss, Mr. Smiles. One of the first surviving elements of that original design pitch. Mr. Smiles was designed to give players a taste of the difficulty they'd be facing throughout the game, but without going too hard. His laser attacks are flashy and threatening, but ultimately not too difficult to dodge. With some practice, this boss should be a breeze. Another idea that I had in my concepts was to create bosses from different game genres to represent the types of video game bosses that join this tournament. The first boss of this type was Trip Ripley, a boss inspired by 90s kart racers that challenges the players to fight and race him at the same time. During the fight, you can crack open item boxes and get a leg up on him in the race. As the calendars turned over to July, I started to devise a scheme that would get my game in front of the proper audience. At a quick glance, Boss Up has a lot of things in common with Terraria. You've got the movement, the dashing, and the giant bosses. I realized early on that my game would appeal to the Terraria boss rush community, so I started adding references and nods to Terraria. I added the Schnoz of Cthulhu, a reference to the eye and the brain of Cthulhu, with creepy, gory attacks and some Terraria-inspired weapons. To this day, a lot of my viewership comes from Terraria fans. The scheme worked. After this bit, I started working on an arcade-inspired boss to represent the earliest video game boss, Donkey Kong. Since Trip Ripley scrolls horizontally, this boss scrolls vertically. Early on, this fight was quite broken, but with some tweaks it became one of the most dynamic bosses in the whole game. As the first boss of the second phase, this fight represented a shift in my design, where I started focusing on surprise to keep the player on their toes throughout the whole fight. Finally, I added a horror boss to appeal to all you sick freaks in the audience. As a fan of horror myself, I wanted to make this boss extra unique, so I started the fight with a firefighting minigame where you would have to protect the forest from burning down. Just as you think you've successfully put out the fire, the real fight begins. A burned and mangled Frankie comes out of the nowhere to wreck your shit. This fight focuses on creepy imagery and a small narrative twist to keep the player engaged in the horror. Meat. This was the month where I started my third year in college. As I was adjusting to my new classes, I was working out a collaboration with Waffle Time. I wanted to put extra effort into this fight to make sure that Waffle Time was as fun to fight as his content is to watch. If you want the full story, you can check out the video in the description. I also focused on polishing the game and adding a hat system, where you can equip one hat at a time and gain a small new effect to change up the boss fight. I also added a shop and a currency system. where you can spend your fight money on new weapons and hats. To wrap up the month, I released the Waffle Time Devlog. This month I got back into the swing of things. I focused on a new Brainrot-inspired boss called Bonesy, a boss that evolved from the concept of Mr. Bones Gaming in my original pitch document. I programmed a rewind and pause gimmick, as well as the fight dialogue to give the boss an extra dose of character. If you like this boss, check out the video that he's from, also in the description. I also went and started on reworking some of the existing bosses. I polished up some broken aspects on Frankie and Badaboon, and I focused on bringing one boss in particular up to full completion. Mr. Smiles got a full rework, polishing up all his attacks, adding new animations, creating a swirling cosmos background, and giving him an intro sequence that eventually every boss is going to have. On the topic of polish, I also added a bunch of new effects to the game to get everything extra appealing. I found a sound designer and implemented some sounds for the player, and got into contact with some music producers to put together just soundtrack for the game. I also fixed a major bug with the rolling system where the player would get stuck rolling until they hit the ground. In November, I finally finished up a major project that I had been working on through the last 2 weeks, the Eternia Boss Rush. I knew early on that this concept was not going to appeal to a lot of people, so I was really designing it just for myself. I remade all 6 bosses from my previous game, Eternia Escape, redesigning their looks and giving them new modernized attack patterns. This fight is a relentless gauntlet. With over 18 attacks, this is one of the hardest in the game. That brings us today. Boss Up now has several fights, over 5,000 lines of code, and a few hundred assets. We're still going strong, and you haven't seen anything yet with the difficulty. Stay tuned for some absolutely crazy bosses in the upcoming weeks, and make sure to like and subscribe so you can stay up to date with the game.